Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Well, it's great to be here, and what an interesting conversation so far. So, I worked for about 20 years in the mining sector as a social performance professional, and I came off a project building sort of a $1.5 billion copper mine, and I thought, what will I do next? And although it seems unlikely, proof that you can be a lifelong learner, I decided in my 50s to go back and do a PhD. And what I was really curious about was, you know, in the past 20 or 25 years, we've seen this remarkable growth in reporting protocols, voluntary standards, guides, and in some cases, legislation to help improve the social performance in the mining sector. And yet at the same time, we see, it seems, increasing instances of conflict. Communities that are dissatisfied, people who feel disenfranchised, many who are complaining that the impacts of mining are very local and the benefits are very global. So I thought, well, it'd be very interesting to go back and do a PhD and look at these issues of social risk and social responsibility. And potentially, is there a pathway forward that's a little bit different? So I sort of think of the University of British Columbia a bit like the Hotel California. I finished my PhD. I did a postdoctoral fellowship, but I can't seem to leave. So I'm still there. I teach in the School of Mining Engineering on a course that I find really interesting, Mining and Society, that looks at these issues of intersectionality between what mining companies want, are good at, do, and need, and equally importantly, I think what communities want and do and are good at and need. And so that's what I'd love to talk with you a little bit more about today is how do we bridge what in some instances can seem like an irreconcilable divide between the commercial imperatives of mining companies and the social justice needs and legitimate concerns of communities.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And yes, I think we met years ago at an event in the one and only Vancouver. And I'm not just
That's
saying
right.
that because we have lots of Vancouverites on the call here today. So with all of that and that potential, I think as you would probably put it, that move from cooperation to collaboration and being able to move through all of that. And things like, so we've just been talking about data, for example, and the sharing of that ESG reporting or sustainability reporting, etc. But that move beyond just sharing data and that move to actually being collaborative in decision making and everybody coming to that table to create that shared value. Starting very basically, what are some of the opportunities in doing this? So why do we think this is a good idea?
Well, yeah, and it's gonna lead us quite quickly to the flip side of opportunity, which is risk or threat. But I do think that in the ideal world, that parallel universe where we would all love to live and work, I do think there is an incredible opportunity for the mining sector to be reframed, to be a catalyst for the sustainable development, the long-term sustainable development of resource-rich regions of the world. And of course, that runs contrary to what we see at the moment, where we have so many communities that are very resource rich and yet are poor, this whole idea about the resource curse. So I do think there's an amazing opportunity there. Have we been able to fully harness that opportunity? No, I don't think so. And, I think that there is some systemic change that's really needed in the industry that's going to pave a pathway for these more collaborative partnerships. And look, on the conference so far, we've heard a lot of great ideas and great initiatives, and that's really encouraging. But I think there's still a lot of scope and scale for change.
Excellent. So there's an opportunity for change, which is always wonderful. Now you mentioned the flip side. Would you like to discuss some of the threats?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess before I do that, Sarah, let me say one thing about data, because working in a university environment, and especially I'm in the School of Mining Engineering, so I mean, the engineers love the data, right? They love the data. And I think it touches a little bit on some of the topics that your other speakers have raised, this idea about the perception reality gap, right? And I mean, for many years, miners used to love to say, oh, if we built it, it's safe. And while that's probably true, as we've heard from others, the perception of the industry doesn't inspire trust and confidence in that. And a lot of the ways that I think traditionally mining companies have looked to build their trust and credibility, and we've heard this discussed before as well, is to use data and say, well, here's the data. It's incontestable, and so you should just have confidence that this is it. I think we're seeing a little bit of that happening in the ESG space, the environment, social, and governance space, where, companies are saying, well, we're using these reporting protocols, we're being transparent, we're sharing our data. And the receivers of that data are saying, you know what, there's no comparability across the different reporting protocols. There's a lack of transparency. The mining companies, are determining what's material. Now, we're hearing talk about double materiality, which I would argue is really community relations. Many of us have been practicing that for 30 years. So how do we, maybe we're at an interesting tipping point, or maybe we're like looking to try to surf on the incoming wave. But I do think that there's a way, if we had better engagement with our communities of interest, to better understand which of these issues are important and what's the best way to share that information so that it really resonates with our target audiences. And we see lots of great work coming out on both sides. I know Emily is working with Global Witness. There was that fascinating report that was released this week looking at the situation in the DRC around cobalt and apples use. So we're seeing great work on both sides of the debate. So the question is, how do we get across this potentially irreconcilable divide? So there's lots of threats. Myron talked about geopolitical risk. Certainly we see a lot of that changing policy. In the critical mineral space, we're seeing lots of governments saying, well, we should speed up the permitting process. We need to make that quicker because, mining is such a critical role in our transition to a green economy. And I would argue, I don't think most communities will be very excited about the idea of speeding up the permitting process. I think that's a real risk.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I was at an event last week in Geneva, and there was a gentleman representing part of the EU, and he actually showed a timeline to say he thinks that you could get a mine from very early stages in terms of the exploration to actually being built in 2 years. I have to say I struggle to understand how that's possible, unless, of course, it's a very advanced project in the first place, so that the timeline is very, very tight. Because the permits, of course, exist there as a control to try and make sure that a lot of this discussion, etc., has happened. I mean, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think Andy's just popped into the chat that permitting is not the only constraint. There certainly are lots of others, but I do think this idea about, well, let's just giddy up and get her done it's not the only solution. And there's lots of questions too linked to these around, how do we ensure a just transition as we make this shift? Like, how do we make sure that no one's left behind? There's something like 400 million people working in the artisanal and informal mining sector. What are we thinking about for them as we make this transition, which we all want, to a low carbon economy? And I think these points of commonality, what we can all agree that we want, are wonderful places to start. So yes, generally speaking, most people would agree we would like to make a transition to a green future. We'd like a low carbon economy. Let's roll it back from there. We see lots of threats too to the mining sector around things like water. So, there was a report that was released this week that predicted that, 80% of copper assets in Chile are going to be water scarce within a couple of years. And in very short order of time, 100% of copper assets in Chile are going to be water stressed. And yet that's led to, in other parts of the world, some really interesting collaborative partnerships where governments, industry, communities are working together. I'm thinking about the work that's being done in the Limpopo province in South Africa, where we've got the government working together with 7 platinum companies and communities to build a bulk raw water distribution network. And that came out of conflict, didn't it? Because communities were saying, we don't have water, you can't use the water, and efforts there to use treated municipal wastewater weren't being effective. So I think there's some really interesting opportunities on the horizon too.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it, that often it takes things to really come to crunch point in order to get that innovation or that step change. So, as we heard from Miran in the previous talk, actually COVID gave rise to huge amounts of innovation. But why do we need to wait for the global pandemic before we innovate? I guess in terms of raw materials, actually, to be brutally honest, we haven't hit crunch point with regards to that yet, perhaps in terms of getting the impetus to go for that innovation. But with that, Jocelyn, there's a huge amount that's changing right now. So
Mhm.
from your perspective, what do you think are some of the most exciting areas in which we're getting this evolution?
Well, and I mean, the title of the conference is Critical Choices. So, I mean, there's so many things that we could be looking at, and I just look at a tiny little piece of it. And so, because I come out of a social performance background, what I'm really interested in is these ideas about social responsibility, social performance, social engagement. And I do think that that is starting to evolve. Like, I think for many years, corporate social responsibility was really anchored by philanthropic investment. And that's critical and it's important, but we know that that's also very transactional. So when we think about these issues of trust that Herta raised earlier in the week, we philanthropic investment doesn't really do very much in terms of building trust that mining is acting in the best interests of society. And I think then we started moving along the spectrum of social responsibility to some more sort of transitional ideas, which often are anchored in performance optimization. So if I'm a large mine, I can reduce my energy footprint, I can reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. These are performance optimization things that also yield some benefit. But do communities really sort of feel that benefit? I don't think so, right? Now, I know Jeff was on earlier in the week and talked about local procurement, and this is a place where we're seeing some really interesting movement. I think a lot of mining companies for a while thought, well, we offer jobs. Like, it's like that's good. That's a local benefit. It's like not really sufficient, right? But in the local procurement space, we're starting to see some really interesting work too, where companies are not just using local suppliers, but they're working with those local suppliers to build their supply chains, right? To help that knowledge transfer to build capacity around responsible and ethical sourcing. There's some interesting work in South Africa where a consortium of 4 local companies have been given the contract to mine at an iron ore mine, right, at Cumbra. In some work that I was looking at in Ecuador, we saw a company, Lundin Gold, that really looked to build out the supply chain so that their catering company, which was locally started, then began to work with smallhold farmers, right? Who sort of said, well, it's great, you've hired the guys to do the catering company, but they're buying all their food from Quito. Like are here in the local province and, we grow food, we have cows. And so that work to build out the supply chain. So I think there's heaps of opportunities there. I do think they need to be considered from a market lens. And so I think for traditional corporate social responsibility, that's a bit tricky because those aren't necessarily those sort of economic development, economic skills are often not the skills that have brought social performance people into the sector. So again, a place where I love Myron's comments about you need to build a multidisciplinary or an interdisciplinary team, right? So that we get both a broader perspective on risk and on the associated opportunities.
Awesome. Jocelyn, Andy has put a corker of a question, I think is the only way to put it, into the chat right now. And Andy asks, could a fully automated mine, i.e. zero local employment, be an ethical source of supply? What do you think?
So I think there's 2 parts to the question. Could it be an ethical source of supply? Perhaps. Will it deliver on the promise that I think mining should have to deliver value to local communities, resource-rich communities? And I think the answer there is no. So, I guess it's a question of, I would take the position that if you're mining a non-renewable resource, once it's discovered, that resource should be mined in a way that generates the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. And I think the people that are most important in that equation are those who live in the region, right? And so I think these ideas about fully automated mines that will probably significantly improve things like supply chain risk and environmental performance are a good option. Are they the only option? Perhaps not. Perhaps not.
Thank you, Jocelyn. And sorry for sideswiping you with that question, but Anne
Good.
Thompson's also come in with a twist. She said, yes, owned by the community! Exclamation.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the places too, where again, I think we see a little bit of a disconnect. So in a number of the critical raw mineral strategies or the green mineral strategies or whatever we call them that are being promoted by governments around the world, where I would point out we have no agreement at all on what is critical and why is it deemed to be critical. Um, here in Canada, for example, our strategy says, oh, this is going to be a great way to support reconciliation with Indigenous people. It's like, well, okay, how is that going to happen? So, I think the devil's in the details in some of these conversations, right? Would Indigenous people own the mine? Would they? We've seen some interesting projects. I think Steve Desposito was on earlier talking about regeneration and his earlier work with Resolve. Glenn was here, so he can tell us more about that. Where Indigenous nations are involved, and we see a lot of opportunity. But again, that's wow. There's going to be a lot of complex work that will be required in the policy side of things, in the governance side of things, to enable these visions to come to fruition.
Awesome. Thank you, Jocelyn. Just coming back to those opportunities, the evolutions, but then do you think there are some underexplored areas that we can lean into? What do you reckon?
Yeah, and I guess for me, Sarah, it's very much tied to this idea about business model change and innovation, right? So if we think about a business model as the way that a company discovers and creates value, I would argue that the business model of mining, I'll go out on a bit of a limb here, but I don't really think it's changed significantly. Maybe there's been some small changes, but in general, I don't think it's changed at all in the last 50 years. And when we think about how much society has changed in that period of time, it raises questions for me about, is the business model of mining fit for purpose in a purpose-driven world? And so I think there's lots of really interesting research that's being done. I think really led out of the European Union, where you've got some amazing scholars looking at these ideas about business model innovation, business models for sustainability. And I think that's coupled really nicely with these changing ideas around shareholder capitalism and stakeholder capitalism. So instead of a model that just generates financial returns for investors, financial institutions, and lending agencies, could mining companies be reframed? Could their business models be reframed to become business models for sustainability? And a fundamental underpinning of that would be these ideas about creating value for all of your stakeholders. And I use that term stakeholders in the academic sense. So that's anybody who has an interest in or could be affected by an operation. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there. But business models require strategy. And again, I think there's an evolving notion there around this idea that Michael Porter and Mark Kramer out of Harvard labeled creating shared value. So this is an economic strategy where you look for points of intersection between mining companies and their impacted communities. And then you explore, where are there some market failures, some macroeconomic market failures in that space? And can we build a collaborative partnership that will advance the conversation? Mining companies will have to move away and embrace something that they're not comfortable with, and I don't see them doing very often, and that's sharing decision making. So it's one thing to go out with these ideas about corporate social responsibility and building collaborative partnerships, but if you're not actually prepared to co-design and co-decide, your partnership isn't going to work very effectively. But I do think that's an evolving space. And again, I think there's some really interesting work. I worked at De Beers back in 2000. And it was a time when there were a lot of big, complicated issues that were impacting the company. Blood diamonds, the HIV/AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And here in Canada, we were trying to build the first 2 mines that De Beers had ever built outside of the African continent. But at that time, there was a voluntary testing program for employees in the mines in Botswana, and the HIV infection rate was huge. Now, when De Beers looked at that, they looked at it from 2 perspectives, caring and compassion for employees, of course, but also through the lens of a commercial imperative. And that led them to develop a comprehensive disease management program in sub-Saharan Africa, which has been remodeled then by subsequent companies later on to look at issues like malaria. So we're not talking about something that's never been done before. We've got some great examples, I think, that we can take some encouragement from.
Excellent. So Jocelyn, any final thoughts for us before we move on to the next talk?
Yeah, I I'm an optimist. I think if you work in the mining industry or if you're attached to the mining industry, and Sarah, you come out of the geology sector, so you have to be an optimist. But I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity, and I think that we're beginning to see, more recognition of the role that non-traditional mining people, social performance experts, people that have an interest in economics, in community development, how there can be places where that knowledge can be combined, right? And I always think, the more people that you get around the table with different perspectives, the bigger brain you end up using. And so I do think we're seeing a lot of movement in that direction, and it won't be easy. But that's okay, because I mean, I think everybody that works in the mining sector is used to hard, difficult problems. And I do think there's a way we can unpack this and help mining be a catalyst for long-term sustainable development.
Love it.
Optimistic.
Of course, absolutely love it. And I love that visualization now that all of us, for example, who have come together today and then over this week, that's one hell of a brain,
Yeah,
isn't it?
it's a big brain. It's exciting.
Some people are adding more than others, but that's a hell of a brain, which is fantastic. So Jocelyn, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your thoughts with us today. As always, truly brilliant. Everybody, Jocelyn.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Fantastic.